day at every rank in the U.S. Army. Today we climb an entire army in a single day, moving rank by rank from the first soldier awake in a barracks room to the general reading reports from a distant headquarters. Across this journey, we will watch a private learn to move with a unit instead of ahead of it, a staff sergeant carry a squad's readiness on paper and in practice, a sergeant major shape an entire battalion through quiet influence rather than direct command, and finally a general experience the same 24 hours as a pattern of briefings and consequences reaching far beyond one building. Each stop reveals what a rank actually does, not just what it is called. If this kind of orderly, before-sunrise history is your cup of tea, leave a comment with the daily routine you think would be hardest to adjust to, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful history. The story begins as the army itself begins each day, in the dark. In a barracks room lit only by the pale wash of a hallway light through a half-open door, a single soldier is already awake before the building around them stirs. The uniform hangs where it was placed the night before, sleeves squared, boots set beside the wall locker with laces loosened just enough to slide the foot in quickly. There is no drama in this moment, only method. A soldier dresses in a practiced order, checking name tape, checking rank insignia, checking that the small menglo is completed for the next day, reading social media, and enjoyment of movement venues mid-cycle. Street lights keep their positions over empty roads. Company buildings sit in even rows, distinguished from one another mostly by small signs marking unit identity. Somewhere on the post, a recorded bugle call known as first call sounds, a brief, businesslike warning that the first formation is only minutes away. It is not a suggestion. At installations such as Fort Jackson, this warning is followed shortly by reveille, and by the time that second call plays, soldiers are expected to already be standing in formation, ready to begin physical training rather than still walking toward it. The gap between warning and expectation is the whole lesson of Army mornings. Time is not something you notice, it is something you anticipate. Outside the company area, junior enlisted soldiers gather into loose lines that sharpen into formation almost automatically, shoulder to shoulder, eyes forward. A sergeant moves along the front rank with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who has done this many mornings before and expects to do it many more. This is not simply a head count. The sergeant is checking three things at once. Is everyone present? Is everyone dressed to standard? And is everyone on time by the unit's clock rather than by personal judgment? A missing reflective belt, an untucked blouse, a half-second delay in falling in. These small things get small corrections here before they can grow into larger problems later in the day. This pattern of inspection during morning formation, where non-commissioned officers watch both people and equipment at once, is one of the oldest fixtures of Army life, and it sets the tone for how closely the rest of the day will be supervised. Physical training follows almost immediately, and rank quietly organizes even this. Junior soldiers move through the exercises together, but sergeants circulate through the formation, adjusting pace, calling corrections, occasionally pulling someone aside to repeat a movement correctly. This is treated less as a test than as a low-pressure rehearsal of habits that matter later. Moving as a group, sustaining effort without individual encouragement, trusting that someone nearby is watching for both performance and safety. It is leadership practice, quietly disguised as exercise. By the time training ends, the post has begun to breathe differently. A version of a bugle call known traditionally as mess call marks the shift from training time to breakfast time, often not long after 7 in the morning on installations that still keep this older rhythm, such as Fort Jackson. Soldiers move from the training field toward a dining facility in loose clusters, uniforms damp, conversation returning in short bursts. On the roads nearby, a different rhythm appears. family vehicles pulling out of housing driveways, off-post commuters merging toward the gate, spouses beginning their own version of the same morning schedule from separate households, where a soldier sleeps and how far they must travel to reach this same formation tomorrow is already something rank and assignment have quietly decided. Inside the dining facility, trays move down the line with a familiar, unspoken efficiency, and soldiers eat quickly, aware that duty start time follows close behind breakfast. Nothing about this moment feels ceremonial, yet it carries the same logic as everything before it. The day belongs to the schedule first, and to the individual only within the room the schedule allows. A soldier who arrives late to formation has failed something structural, not merely personal, because someone above them had to notice it, and someone above that person had to account for it in turn. This is the quiet truth underneath every version of the Army Day this episode will follow. Before any vehicle is inspected, before any report is filed, before any briefing room fills with officers reviewing readiness charts, the Army has already organized itself around alignment, shared time, shared expectation, and a visible chain of who checks whom. The private dressing alone in the dark and the sergeant walking the formation line are doing two different jobs, but they are doing them inside the same structure, at the same hour, for the same reason. That reason becomes easier to see once the day moves past formation and into actual work, when a new soldier begins learning not just how to be present, but how to be useful. Being useful, though, is not a switch that flips overnight. It is a slow accumulation of small permissions, and the Army built its entire junior enlisted structure around that accumulation. The new private who dressed alone in the dark is not expected to understand the unit yet. He is expected to show up, follow, and absorb. What he absorbs first is rhythm, and what comes after rhythm is task, and what comes after task eventually is trust. The morning still belongs to the group. On the training field, as the sky lightens from gray to pale blue, a squad of junior soldiers in current physical training gear moves through warm-ups behind a non-commissioned officer who calls the pace rather than explains it. Nobody is thinking about long-term development at this hour. They are thinking about breathing, about staying in step, about not being the one who falls behind and draws attention. This is not humiliation for its own sake. It is repetition doing its quiet work. The Army's own guidance for new soldiers, gathered in materials aimed specifically at privates through specialists, treats this stretch of service as a period of maintained proficiency in basics rather than one-time instruction. You do not learn to run in formation once. You learn it every morning until your body stops asking questions your mind used to ask. Breakfast follows, unremarkable and functional, taken in a dining facility that runs on its own separate clock of trays and serving lines. Then work call, and the day's shape changes from collective motion to individual assignment, though supervision remains close. This is where a new private earns the second half of the E1 through E3 period, not by displaying initiative, but by demonstrating that he can be handed a small piece of a larger job and complete it correctly. Picture a maintenance bay attached to a motor pool at mid-morning, vehicles half disassembled or waiting their turn, tool laid out with more order than the room itself suggests. A private and a private first class work here under close watch, cleaning parts, checking fluid levels, tightening what they've been told to tighten, while an experienced specialist or mechanic corrects their grip on a wrench or points out a fitting they missed. Nothing about this task is dramatic, and that is precisely the point. The lesson is not the specific bolt. The lesson is that competence is built through thousands of corrected small motions, and that a junior soldier's early value lies in reliability rather than judgment. Judgment comes later, once the basic vocabulary of the job is second nature. This period, spanning private through private first class and into early specialist time, is what Army career progression guidance treats as a single developmental band. documents built for enlisted career fields, including finance and other technical specialties, group private through specialist or corporal together as a shared early stage, one defined less by rank distinctions than by a common expectation, self-development, repeated exposure to standards, and steady absorption of a military occupational specialty's fundamentals. The names on the rank chart change one grade at a time, but the actual daily experience shifts more slowly and more by feel than by title. Something does begin to change by the time a soldier reaches specialist, though. The correction becomes less constant. The specialist is still, in the Army's formal structure, a junior enlisted soldier without command authority over anyone. But informally, and often practically, this is the point where a unit starts treating a soldier less like someone to watch and more like someone to rely on. A specialist working at a bench, solving a technical problem largely without narration from a supervisor, is not performing a different task than the private did months earlier. It is often the very same category of work. What has changed is the amount of oversight required to get it done correctly. This is where the Army's rank system reveals something civilians often miss. Official framing describes military rank not merely as a pay structure, but as an organized reflection of expertise, responsibility, and authority moving together, though not always at the same pace. A specialist can accumulate real expertise and even real responsibility for equipment or a task, well before receiving the kind of authority that comes with formally supervising other soldiers. Knowledge, in other words, can outrun rank, at least for a while. The chapter's clearest illustration of this arrives at the peculiar seam in the enlisted ladder, at the pay grade of E4. Here, the Army does something unusual. It splits one grade into two distinct roles that look identical on a paycheck, but diverge sharply in daily function. A specialist at E4 is typically a technician, someone valued for skill with a system, a vehicle, or a task, without an expectation that they will direct other soldiers. A corporal, sitting at the same pay grade, has crossed into the formal non-commissioned officer structure and stepped into a position of command authority over subordinates, however small that span of control might be. It's a distinction easiest to see side by side, so imagine both soldiers finishing the same afternoon in the same motor pool. The specialist is bent over a workbench, quietly finishing a repair that requires patience and specific technical familiarity, largely left alone to do it. Nearby, a corporal is giving brief, practical direction to a couple of newer soldiers, checking that a task got assigned correctly and that nothing was skipped. Same rank chart number, different job. The Army has been careful in its own internal guidance to draw a boundary around when a soldier should actually step into that leadership lane. Career progress documentation for enlisted development states plainly that non-commissioned officers should not be placed into key developmental leadership positions unless they've completed the required professional military education for that grade. Ability alone does not authorize the leap. A specialist might be more technically gifted than the corporal working beside them, and the Army's structure accepts that without discomfort, because expertise and formal leadership are treated as separate qualifications that happen to overlap in some careers and diverge in others. By the end of this stretch, from the private dressing in the dark to the specialist working independently at a bench, the day itself has not changed all that much in its outward shape. Physical training, meals on schedule, work call, supervised tasks, cleaning, maintenance. What has changed is the density of instruction required to get through it. Fewer reminders, less hovering, more tasks completed correctly on the first attempt. The uniform still says junior enlisted, and the chain of command above them is unchanged, but the lived experience of the day has quietly stopped being a lesson and started becoming a job. That shift in trust, though, is not the same as a shift in authority, and the Army keeps those two things separated on purpose until a soldier proves ready for both. The next step up the ladder is where authority formally arrives, carried first by the corporal's small squad and then by the sergeant and staff sergeant who inherit the fuller weight of leading other people through their own version of this same demanding day. Authority, once it arrives, does not announce itself with any ceremony beyond a new set of stripes and a change in how people speak to a soldier. The habit of watching, correcting, and following through that carried a private through his first months now becomes someone else's job to expect of him. The corporal inherits the smallest unit the army recognizes as a leadership position, usually a team of 3 or 4 soldiers, and the work looks almost identical to what came before it. The difference is that now the corporal decides whether the work was done correctly and answers for it if it was not. Picture that corporal in a company office or supply room at mid-morning, holding a task list a private and a specialist were supposed to have finished. The list itself is unremarkable. Inventory a set of equipment, clean and stage it, log what is missing. What matters is what happens when something on that list is wrong. Army doctrine describes the corporal as the base of the non-commissioned officer ranks, one of only 2 grades that have remained continuously part of the NCO structure since the earliest days of the institution, though the finer details of that long continuity are a matter of record-keeping rather than living memory and worth holding loosely. What the doctrine states plainly is the job itself. A corporal is responsible for the individual training, personal appearance and cleanliness of the soldiers under him, in exactly the same way a sergeant is. So when the inventory comes back short, or the gear is clean on top and neglected underneath, the corporal cannot simply redo it himself and move on. He has to stop, point out what was missed, and explain why it matters, while a sergeant nearby watches to see whether the correction actually lands. That watching is not distrust. It is how the army checks whether a new leader is learning to lead or just learning to bark orders. This is the quiet hinge of the whole rank structure. A specialist with 3 years of experience might be a better mechanic, a better gunner, or a better clerk than the corporal standing beside him, but the specialist is not, by design, responsible for anyone else's standards. The corporal is. The stripes changed nothing about his hands-on skill and everything about what he now owns when someone else's work falls short. By the time a soldier is a sergeant, that ownership has widened from a team to a full squad, and the day starts to include a category of problem that has nothing to do with equipment at all. Sergeants are the first-line supervisors of the enlisted force, the ones who live daily life alongside the soldiers they lead rather than observing it from a distance, and Army doctrine ties that closeness directly to responsibility for a soldier's health, welfare, and safety. In practice, that means a sergeant's morning might include a maintenance task and a personnel problem back-to-back, with no clean boundary between them. Take the motor pool at late morning, tactical vehicles lined in the yard, maintenance bays open to the light. A sergeant supervises a small group of soldiers checking fluid levels, inspecting undercarriages, cleaning bays that always seem to need cleaning again by the time anyone looks twice. This work is routine almost to the point of tedium, and that tedium is exactly the danger the sergeant is guarding against, because a missed fluid check today is a broken down vehicle during an exercise next month. While that inspection runs, the sergeant is also, almost without switching gears, the person a young soldier will mention a financial problem to, or a family matter, or trouble sleeping. Doctrine treats this counseling function as central to the job rather than incidental to it. Sergeants provide the counseling, training, and personal attention that determine whether a mission actually succeeds and whether small problems get caught at home station before they turn into something larger, somewhere less forgiving. None of this requires drama. It usually looks like a short conversation near a tool bench, easy to miss if no one is looking for it, followed by the sergeant returning to the vehicle checklist as though nothing happened, because to the squad, nothing dramatic did happen. That is the point of doing it well. the Staff Sergeant's day takes that same responsibility and organizes it. Where a sergeant is often working shoulder to shoulder inside a single task, a Staff Sergeant is usually a half step back, holding the version of the day that has to fit together as a whole. A training plan, a maintenance schedule, a roster of who is present, who is on leave, who still needs a certification renewed before the quarter closes out. The specific administrative rhythm of a Staff Sergeant's schedule is not spelled out in a single fixed document, so this is best understood as a representative reconstruction of how squad-level readiness tends to get managed, rather than a script every squad follows. Picture that Staff Sergeant near midday in a training or maintenance area, notebook open, radio clipped to a vest, adjusting a squad exercise that is not unfolding quite the way the schedule intended. Two soldiers finished a task faster than expected and are standing idle, while a third is stuck and quietly falling behind. The Staff Sergeant's job in that moment is not to do any single soldier's task, but to notice the imbalance and correct it before the squad's whole afternoon slips off pace. This is translation work as much as supervision. Guidance that arrived from the company as a broad training objective has to become something a dozen individual soldiers can actually execute with the equipment on hand in whatever weather the day happens to bring. None of these three ranks command in the dramatic sense the word sometimes suggests. What they do, at increasing scale, is prevent small failures from becoming unit problems. A corporal catches a sloppy inventory before it becomes a shortage discovered during an inspection. A sergeant catches a distracted or struggling soldier before that struggle becomes an accident in the motor pool. A Staff Sergeant catches a training plan drifting out of alignment before the squad shows up unprepared for whatever the company actually needs from them the following week. The authority attached to each of these ranks exists almost entirely in service of that catching, and the Army's own doctrine frames the job less as command for its own sake than as a set of core competencies built around readiness, accountability, and the steady daily management of people and equipment before small problems have a chance to grow teeth. Across all three ranks, the shape of the day changes less than the weight riding on it. A corporal is still close enough to the work to do it himself if needed, and often does, hands still in the equipment even while his eyes are on someone else's. A sergeant carries that closeness into the personal, becoming the person young soldiers actually confide in, long before any issue reaches an officer's desk. A Staff Sergeant steps back just far enough to see the whole squad at once, trading some of that hands-on closeness for the wider view a functioning team requires. None of it removes the leader from the work entirely, which is part of why the Army calls this level of leadership non-commissioned rather than command in the fuller sense reserved for officers. By the time a soldier reaches Staff Sergeant, the squad's readiness has become something closely tracked and organized, rather than instinctively managed, but it still rests on the same habit of watching, correcting, and following through that began back at Corporal. The next step up the ladder does not abandon that habit so much as widen its field of view, as a Sergeant First Class begins thinking not just about one squad's problems, but about how every squad in a platoon fits together into a single working whole. That widening field of view is exactly where the Sergeant First Class picks up the day. A platoon runs somewhere between 20 and 40 soldiers, organized into squads or sections, and by this rank, a leader can no longer rely on simply knowing everyone by name and habit the way a staff sergeant might with a squad. The platoon is too large for that kind of close, personal tracking, but still small enough that its problems remain visible if the right person walks through it at the right hour. That is the Sergeant First Class's real advantage, proximity to the work, combined with enough seniority to see how all the pieces are supposed to fit together. By mid-morning, after physical training and the early administrative churn have passed, the Sergeant First Class is typically found walking the platoon's training or work area alongside the platoon leader, a commissioned officer who is usually younger and less experienced in the actual mechanics of daily Army life. This pairing is not incidental. Doctrine describes the platoon sergeant as the platoon's most experienced non-commissioned officer and its second in charge, accountable to the platoon leader for the discipline, training, and welfare of every soldier in the formation. In practice, this means the platoon leader sets the intent, and the sergeant first class translates that intent into something soldiers can actually execute on a given morning, given the equipment and time actually available. Walking the formation area, the Sergeant First Class asks the kind of plain, practical questions that rarely appear on any written plan. Who is missing and why? Whether the training aids arrived, whether a vehicle or weapon system is still down for maintenance, whether a squad leader flagged a supply shortfall the night before. None of these questions are dramatic. They are the accumulated residue of experience, the same habit of watching and correcting that began back at Corporal, now stretched across several squads instead of one. The Sergeant First Class is close enough to notice a soldier's boots are wrong, a report is late, a tool is missing from a kit, and senior enough to know which of those problems the platoon leader needs to hear about right away and which can simply be fixed on the spot. That fixing often happens right there in the open, without paperwork. If a training lane is running behind schedule, the Sergeant First Class might step in and correct a soldier's technique directly, using a hasty diagram in the dirt or a quick sketch on a nearby whiteboard to show where the sequence broke down. This is a reconstructed, representative scene rather than a documented event, but it reflects a well-established pattern in Army training management. NCOs are expected to manage training at the platoon level as a hands-on, continuous responsibility, not a task reserved for classrooms or scheduled instruction blocks. A platoon-level training handbook produced by the Army specifically frames this kind of active, in-the-moment supervision as central to how platoons stay proficient between larger, formally scheduled training events. The corrections rarely stop at technique. A Sergeant First Class is also tracking morale and health across the platoon, the kind of subtler signal that doctrine explicitly assigns to the senior NCO, monitoring discipline, fatigue, and welfare, and receiving squad leaders' logistical and maintenance reports as those details accumulate throughout the day. A soldier who seems distracted, a squad that seems short on sleep, a section that has been running the same broken equipment for 3 days without saying so loudly enough. These are the platoon-level frictions that rarely reach an officer's desk unless someone senior enough recognizes the pattern and decides it matters. This is also where supply and maintenance enter the day's work almost without announcement. Doctrine places the platoon sergeant in direct coordination with the company's first sergeant or executive officer for logistical support, which means the Sergeant First Class is not merely observing problems, but actively requesting rations, fuel, parts, or replacement equipment through the company's support structure. When a maintenance issue surfaces during the morning walkthrough, the fix is rarely instant. Instead, the Sergeant First Class notes it, estimates how urgent it actually is, and decides whether it needs to move up the chain that same afternoon or whether it can wait for the next regular reporting cycle. By early afternoon, this accumulated information usually finds its way into a small office near the platoon's administrative space, where the Sergeant First Class sits down to review a roster and a maintenance list, coordinating with the platoon sergeant if these are separate people in this particular unit, or simply consolidating the day's own notes if the two roles happen to be the same. Absences get explained or escalated. Recurring equipment faults get flagged for the next work order. None of this looks impressive to an outside observer glancing at a clipboard, but this is precisely the mechanism by which a platoon's daily friction gets absorbed before it becomes a problem serious enough to reach a commander's desk. The Sergeant First Class is, in effect, running quality control on the platoon's own internal reporting, catching errors and omissions before they can travel any further up the chain. What makes this rank distinct is not authority in a strict legal sense. A sergeant first class does not command the platoon leader does, but a functional authority built entirely out of experience. The platoon leader may hold the formal decision-making power, yet will often defer to the sergeant first class's judgment about how something should actually be executed, simply because the sergeant first class has usually served in this army far longer and has already seen several versions of the same recurring problem. This is often the moment where institutional memory becomes tangible, knowledge that exists nowhere in a regulation but has been earned through repetition, passed informally from one experienced NCO to the next, and now offered as practical guidance to a still developing officer standing beside him in the training area. By the end of the duty day, the platoon's readiness picture has usually been shaped less by any single decision and more by dozens of small corrections made across the morning and afternoon. A scheduling gap closed, a supply request submitted a day earlier than it might otherwise have been, a training weakness caught and corrected before a formal evaluation could expose it publicly. The sergeant first class's contribution is difficult to point to directly because its value lies almost entirely in the problems that never fully materialize. This is the essence of the rank's purpose within the Army's structure. Not visible command, but reliable, experienced stewardship that keeps a platoon functioning as one coherent, working organism, rather than a loose collection of squads each pursuing its own version of the day. As the platoon's day winds down and the sergeant first class hands the last notes and reports up toward company level, the same underlying pattern begins to repeat itself at a slightly larger scale. There, a master sergeant may carry similar technical weight without ever commanding troops directly, while a first sergeant inherits an entire company's worth of these same daily frictions, multiplied many times over and compressed into a single, far busier office. That widening field of view left off with a promise that the same daily friction repeats at company level, only heavier, and split between two soldiers who share a single pay grade. Walking into their two rooms on the same afternoon makes that split easy to see, because almost nothing about their hours looks alike, even though both soldiers wear the same E8 rank. In the first room, somewhere near the battalion's planning spaces, a master sergeant sits at a table covered with maps, equipment status reports, and training rosters. The work is dense but contained. This soldier is often the senior enlisted voice inside a staff section, the person junior planners and specialists turn to when a schedule does not match the reality units are actually living, or when a maintenance report does not line up with what the motor pool has running. A master sergeant's authority comes less from standing in front of formations and more from depth of experience, institutional memory, and the ability to translate field conditions into workable plans. This is a representative afternoon rather than a fixed routine, since staff duties shift with unit type and mission, but the underlying pattern holds across many Army staff sections. Technical judgment applied steadily, with less public drama and fewer interruptions than a company generates. Down the hall, in a different kind of office entirely, a first sergeant's afternoon looks nothing like that. There is no single task lasting an unbroken hour. A soldier's leave paperwork needs a signature before close of business. A vehicle deadline needs reporting up the chain. A private's roommate conflict has grown loud enough that someone above squad level had to step in. The first sergeant is, by long Army tradition and doctrine, the senior enlisted advisor to the company commander, and that plain description undersells how constant the role feels in practice. Nothing about the job stays still long enough to be called one occupation. It is personnel work, discipline work, morale work, and logistics coordination, sometimes all inside the same 20 minutes. Late in the duty day, outside the company area, that difference becomes visible to anyone simply standing nearby. Formation gathers and the first sergeant stands out front, not lecturing so much as accounting. Who is present, who is not, why, and what happens next. The commander often stands close by, but it is the first sergeant's voice carrying the details, because this is where standards get spoken aloud. A uniform note, an upcoming training block, a reminder about barracks cleanliness, a mention of an inspection 2 days out. None of it is dramatic by itself. Together it forms the running maintenance of a company's discipline, repeated in some version nearly every day this rank exists. This is also where the Army's hierarchy stops looking mechanical and starts looking social. Earlier ranks dealt heavily in tasks, vehicles, checklists, timelines, technical execution. At first sergeant, the material changes. The job becomes lives, and the pressures attached to lives. A soldier struggling with a marriage strained by long field rotations. A single parent negotiating childcare around a schedule that will not bend for it. A soldier whose finances have quietly grown unstable enough to threaten a security clearance. None of that shows up on paper as clearly as a broken axle would, but all of it eventually moves through the first sergeant's office, because that office is where the commander expects to hear about it first, and often earliest. That flow of people continues into the evening in a smaller, more private version of the same pattern. Behind a closed door, a first sergeant sits across a desk from one soldier for a counseling session that might last only 10 minutes but carries real weight. The subject could be a performance problem, a pattern of lateness, or something more personal that has begun affecting the unit around it. Army guidance describes this responsibility plainly, placing protection of a soldier's health, welfare, and morale inside the first sergeant's job description as a standing duty, alongside training and discipline, not an occasional add-on. What that guidance cannot fully capture is how repetitive this becomes across a single week, one soldier after another, each carrying a different problem into the same chair, each expecting the same steadiness in return. Outside that office, as the session ends, the ordinary evidence of family life becomes visible without anyone announcing it. Soldiers head toward the parking area, some toward on-post housing, others toward cars bound for off-post neighborhoods, home to spouses, children, dinner schedules, and the everyday negotiations that come with military life. The first sergeant's day does not end when that stream of people leaves. There is usually one more phone call to make, one more note to write for tomorrow, one more small piece of unfinished business that will not wait for morning formation. It would be easy to assume the master sergeant carries the lighter path simply because the hours look calmer from outside, but that comparison misses the actual point of the split. Both roles demand real expertise built across many years of enlisted service, and the difference between them is not competence, since both ranks already require plenty of that, proven long before E8. The difference is exposure. A master sergeant's expertise is applied mostly within controlled settings, among planners and specialists who already share the technical language being used. A first sergeant's expertise is applied constantly, in public, often on subjects with no fixed procedure at all, where the right answer depends on judgment rather than a manual, and where the audience includes an entire company watching how the answer is delivered. Army career materials list these two titles together at the same pay grade for a reason. Institutionally, they represent identical seniority and identical trust from the Army as a system. But trust at this rank splits into two distinct shapes once it reaches daily practice. One shape sits at a table with reports and helps a system work correctly from the inside, largely unseen by soldiers outside the staff section. The other stands in front of a formation, walks into a noisy office several times before lunch, and absorbs whatever the day throws at a company before deciding what the commander actually needs to hear next. Stated plainly, since it is this chapter's real answer, at E8 the Army does not ask for one kind of senior leader, but for two, one built for depth, and one built for almost constant interruption, and an organization this size genuinely needs both working at once to function. That need for steadiness under interruption does not disappear once a soldier leaves company level behind. It simply changes altitude, following the same senior enlisted instinct upward into a role built to advise commanders at a far larger scale, while still carrying, underneath every briefing, the same old responsibility for the people standing beneath each decision made above them, which is exactly where the sergeant major picks up the story next. That change in altitude is exactly what waits at the top of the enlisted ladder, where responsibility for the people beneath a decision stops belonging to one office and starts being carried across an entire battalion or an entire brigade at once. The sergeant major's day often begins somewhere ordinary, a headquarters hallway in the last hour before the building empties for the evening. There is no formation to run here, no single company waiting to be checked. Instead, there are offices, framed unit histories on the walls, and soldiers moving between meetings who straighten slightly when they notice who has just walked past. The sergeant major does not need to say anything for that shift in posture to happen. Years of rank and reputation do work that a direct order once did at lower levels, and much of the job now lives in that kind of felt presence rather than in visible correction. What the sergeant major is actually checking, though, is not paperwork so much as atmosphere. Is this hallway the kind of place where a soldier with a real problem would feel comfortable stopping someone to mention it? Does the tone in this building match what the readiness numbers upstairs claim it should be? These are not questions with a checklist answer, and that is precisely the point. Army writing on the roll describes the senior enlisted leader at this level as responsible for setting standards for training and assessing readiness across an entire formation, not simply reporting on one unit's condition after the fact. That responsibility becomes concrete once the command sergeant major sits down across from a battalion commander, usually with readiness slides open between them and a short list of soldier issues waiting underneath the numbers. This is where the enlisted path most clearly stops resembling a bigger version of a first sergeant's job. A first sergeant answers to a company commander in a fairly direct chain, correcting problems inside one shared building most days. A command sergeant major and a battalion or brigade commander instead work as something closer to two experienced professionals solving the same puzzle from different vantage points, each bringing a different kind of expertise into the room. Army writing on this relationship describes it as a distinctly different partnership than the one found at company level, built less on supervision and more on mutual counsel between two people who are both, by this point in their careers, experts at their craft. Reading a slide about a maintenance metric or a training completion rate is easy enough for anyone in the room. What the command sergeant major adds is the layer underneath the number, the human explanation a spreadsheet cannot supply on its own. Maybe a squad's low completion rate traces back to one soldier struggling with a family situation nobody wrote down anywhere official. Maybe a unit's equipment readiness dipped not from neglect, but because 3 experienced mechanics rotated out in the same month. The commander needs both the number and the reason, and supplying that reason reliably and honestly is a large part of what the senior enlisted advisor is there for. This kind of judgment is described in Army professional writing as a defining feature of the role, even though it resists being reduced to a single fixed duty, since much of it depends on the specific dialogue a sergeant major maintains with a specific commander over time. Some of that judgment is formalized through systems the sergeant major is expected to help keep functioning correctly across the whole formation: medical readiness tracking, individual training records, award processing, evaluation timelines. None of these are glamorous, and none of them involve a sergeant major standing over one soldier's shoulder the way a squad leader might. Instead, the job is closer to making sure the machinery that tracks thousands of small individual facts about soldiers is actually working the way it is supposed to, and flagging it to the right people when it is not. Several companies, hundreds of soldiers, and dozens of overlapping personnel systems all funnel upward into a handful of senior enlisted eyes, checking whether the picture reported to headquarters matches the picture actually visible on the ground. As the afternoon light starts to lean toward evening, that same instinct for verification tends to pull the sergeant major physically out of the headquarters building and into the spaces where the work actually happens. Walking a motor pool at this level does not mean inspecting one vehicle's dispatch folder the way a squad leader once might have. It means moving past racks and bays across several company areas in succession, watching how consistently the same standard shows up from one unit to the next. A brigade's worth of vehicles, equipment cages, and personnel spaces cannot all be memorized the way a single platoon's gear once was, so the walk becomes a kind of sampling rather than a full inspection, a deliberate search for patterns rather than a hunt for one broken part in one bay. This is where the phrase senior enlisted authority earns its odd reputation for being both understated and far-reaching at the same time. A sergeant major rarely issues a direct correction to a soldier 3 companies away, the way a first sergeant might correct someone standing right in front of him. What actually happens is narrower and more indirect. The sergeant major notices something worth noticing, mentions it to the right commander at the right moment, and that mention reshapes what gets attention at the next commander's update or the next training calendar. The correction still lands, but it lands through someone else's decision, which is exactly why the influence can be so easy to overlook in the moment and so consequential once it takes effect weeks later. That difference between direct supervision and shaped attention is really the whole shift this rank represents. A corporal corrects a soldier standing in front of him. A first sergeant corrects an entire company through direct daily presence in one building. A sergeant major corrects an institution by deciding again and again what a commander notices and what a commander is allowed to overlook. It is an unusual kind of power, mostly invisible in the moment it is exercised, and its true size only becomes obvious later, when a battalion's readiness trend either holds steady or quietly comes apart, depending on whether that daily habit of noticing was actually being practiced across the formation, week after week, long before any report ever reached a headquarters desk. The enlisted ladder ends here, at this altitude of counsel and pattern rather than direct command, but it is not the only ladder the Army built. Alongside it runs a different kind of authority entirely, one measured not by how many people a leader oversees, but by how deeply that leader understands a single technical system down to its smallest working part. And that separate path, carried by the warrant officer, is where the story turns next. That separate path, measured by depth rather than reach, is not a rank the Army hands out casually. A warrant officer is chosen because someone has already demonstrated a narrow, deep kind of mastery, and the Army spends years afterward refining that mastery rather than broadening it into something more general. This is the distinction worth sitting with before following one through an afternoon. A warrant officer is not a substitute for a commissioned officer who simply happens to know more machinery, and not a senior enlisted soldier who salutes differently. The role occupies its own lane, built specifically to keep technical judgment inside the chain of command without diluting it into generalist leadership. The rank structure reflects that intention from the start. A newly accessed Warrant Officer 1 already carries a defined level of technical ability, usually developed through years of enlisted or civilian specialization before the Army ever assigns the title. The Army's own Warrant Officer Personnel Development Guidance describes this population as being brought in with that ability already established, then sharpened through progressive assignment and formal schooling as they advance toward Chief Warrant Officer 2, 3, 4, and eventually 5. It is less a climb through layers of command and more a climb through layers of proficiency, each one expected to deepen rather than widen the officer's usefulness. A Chief Warrant Officer 5 near the end of that path is not commanding more people than a Chief Warrant Officer 2. That senior warrant simply understands more about the system in more conditions, with fewer surprises left to encounter. That proficiency is easiest to see in the kind of afternoon many warrant officers actually have. Picture one walking into a maintenance bay where a piece of equipment has failed in a way nobody junior has been able to explain. Panels are open, a diagnostic readout glows somewhere nearby, and 2 or 3 enlisted specialists stand around looking mildly frustrated. The warrant officer does not take over the wrench. Instead, there is a period of listening, a few pointed questions about sequence and symptom, and then a slow walk through the system's logic out loud, thinking through what a normal fault would look like and where this one diverges from it. This scene is reconstructed as a representative moment rather than a documented event, but it captures something the Army states plainly about the role. Warrant officers administer, manage, maintain, operate, and integrate Army systems and equipment, acting as technical experts even while also functioning as leaders and trainers within their own teams. That same expertise carries into rooms with less grease and more paperwork. An intelligence warrant officer might spend a comparable afternoon walking a commander through the reliability of a data source, weighing which pieces of information deserve weight and which deserve suspicion. An aviation warrant officer might be reviewing flight readiness figures before deciding whether a particular aircraft is fit to fly that evening. The occupations differ, but the shape of the task does not change much between them. An official Army description of the warrant officer role calls them technically and tactically focused, serving as technical leaders and advisors who train functional sections, teams, or crews, and who act as the primary technical advisor to whichever commander they support. The commander still commands. The warrant officer's job is to make sure that command decision rests on an accurate, tested understanding of how the system actually behaves under pressure. This advisory posture becomes especially visible in the safety-focused corners of the Army, where misunderstanding a system carries severe consequences. Ammunition warrant officers, for instance, are described as providing subject matter expertise on the safe handling, storage, transportation, and issue of explosive materials, guiding commanders through procedures where a small technical mistake could produce very large harm. Their days often include staff work, participation in safety boards, and coordination across multiple units, which shows how much of a warrant officer's authority operates through documentation, inspection, and coordination, rather than through direct command over troops. One Army article on this specialty describes the role almost as a standing conscience for explosive safety, someone whose entire purpose is to make sure procedure and physics are respected, even when operational pressure pushes hard toward shortcuts. Later in the day, that same warrant officer might be standing in a hangar or a secured classroom, briefing a small group on system performance or safety trends, while the actual hardware, a helicopter, a maintenance rig, a diagnostic console, sits nearby as a physical point of reference. The brief itself is rarely dramatic. It tends to move steadily through numbers, patterns, and known failure points, the kind of information that only becomes meaningful after years of watching a system behave under many different conditions and loads. An Army sustainment publication draws a clear line here, describing certain warrant officer roles explicitly as technical experts rather than executives, a distinction meant to prevent the position from drifting into a shadow command structure that competes with the officer actually responsible for the unit. As the workday tips toward evening, the warrant officer is often on the move again, crossing the installation toward another site where a similar problem is waiting or where a commander has requested the same expertise applied to a different situation entirely. This travel is less about hierarchy and more about utility. A warrant officer's expertise does not sit behind a desk waiting to be summoned. It goes to wherever the equipment, the mission, or the commander happens to need it that day, sometimes twice in a single afternoon. A recent overview of warrant officer professional education reinforces this picture, describing the expectation that warrant officers integrate technical expertise directly into an organization's planning, communicate clearly and candidly with leaders at every level, and provide advice that is both technically sound and operationally realistic rather than theoretical. None of this makes a warrant officer a better officer than a lieutenant or a colonel, and the Army does not present it that way. It presents the warrant path as a different kind of professional altogether, one whose credibility is earned through sustained closeness to a single system rather than through breadth of command experience across many. The Army keeps this lane open because certain problems are only ever solved by someone who has spent years living inside the details, and because commanders, however capable, cannot personally master every technical domain their units depend on. It is that same underlying need for depth, oddly enough, that eventually reappears at the very top of the officer path, though in a very different form, as the story now turns toward the broader generalist climb from second lieutenant to general. That same underlying need for depth, the one that shapes a warrant officer's entire career, reappears at the top of the commissioned path, though almost nobody notices it at first. It shows up disguised as a brand new second lieutenant, standing in a company office with a rank that technically outranks nearly every enlisted soldier in the building, and yet controls almost nothing on his own. The insignia changes the moment he pins it on. The judgment required to use that insignia well does not arrive with it, and everyone around him, including the lieutenant himself if he is paying attention, understands that difference immediately. The morning this chapter follows begins ordinarily enough. A second lieutenant, only weeks into his first assignment, sits down across a desk from his platoon sergeant, likely a staff sergeant or sergeant first class carrying a decade more experience than he has. Between them sits a roster, a training calendar, and a rough sketch of the terrain the platoon will use later that week. The lieutenant has studied leadership theory, weapons systems, and tactics in some detail, usually in classrooms far from any actual platoon. What he has not yet learned, because it cannot be learned anywhere except here, is how this particular platoon runs on an ordinary Tuesday. Army guidance on platoon leadership treats this relationship as a command team by design, not as a courtesy extended to a young officer still finding his footing. The lieutenant holds legal authority and ultimate responsibility for everything the platoon does. The platoon sergeant holds working knowledge of every soldier's status, every piece of equipment's true condition, and every informal rule that keeps 30 people moving as one unit instead of 30 separate problems. Neither person can do the job alone, and both of them already know it, even if only one of them has said so out loud. So the meeting is not really a briefing in the formal sense. It is closer to an apprenticeship conducted in short, practical bursts, spread across weeks rather than settled in one sitting. The platoon sergeant walks through which soldiers are dealing with family issues that week, which vehicle is still waiting on a part that has not arrived, and which squad leader needs a little more watching before a task is handed to him unsupervised. The lieutenant listens, asks the occasional question, and slowly begins filling in the gap between the platoon described in a manual and the platoon that actually exists down the hall from this office. This is, in its own understated way, the entire theme of the officer path in miniature. Rank changes first, and the judgment required to use it well arrives only afterward, earned through exactly these kinds of unremarkable mornings, repeated until they stop feeling unfamiliar. Over the following months and years, if the story is allowed to continue past this single day, that same lieutenant typically moves from platoon leader toward company command, usually while holding the rank of captain. Army guidance on company leadership describes this step plainly, framing it as one of the most demanding roles in the entire career path, not because any single task is exotic, but because everything now converges on one office and one signature. A company commander is responsible for roughly 100 soldiers, along with their training, their equipment, their discipline, and their general welfare, all arriving at once rather than in tidy sequence. The commander still relies on a first sergeant the same way the lieutenant once relied on a platoon sergeant, but the scope has widened considerably, and so has the number of decisions that cannot simply be handed to someone else. Readiness reports, safety concerns, scheduling conflicts, and personnel actions arrive throughout the day, and it falls to the commander to weigh them against one another and decide, often quickly, what happens next. By early afternoon, the story shifts upward again, away from any single company and into the layered administrative world of the battalion and brigade staff. This is where majors and lieutenant colonels typically spend their working hours, functioning less as direct troop leaders and more as planners, coordinators, and problem solvers embedded inside a headquarters building. Picture a battalion staff office, calmer in tone than a company area, filled with computer screens rather than motor pool bays. A major here might be responsible for coordinating training schedules across several companies at once, translating broad guidance from above into specific timelines that unit leaders can actually follow. A lieutenant colonel might already command a battalion outright, standing at the head of several company commanders, the way a captain once stood at the head of several squad leaders, but now managing that relationship mostly through briefings, written guidance, and trust accumulated over repeated interactions rather than daily physical presence in every motor pool. This is also where the day begins to visibly change shape and where the episode's visual field widens along with it. The center of attention moves from a single desk to a briefing room, screens glowing with slides that summarize readiness percentages, maintenance backlogs, and personnel strength by unit. Around the table sit a major handling logistics details, a lieutenant colonel commanding one of the battalions, and perhaps a colonel representing the brigade level above them both. Doctrine on Mission Command describes exactly this kind of layered structure in which senior leaders set intent and expect subordinate commanders to execute it using their own judgment, with results filtered back upward through reports rather than through personal observation. The colonel in that room is not micromanaging any single company's motor pool. The colonel is instead trying to understand through slides and summarized numbers whether the brigade as a whole can execute its next mission on schedule and where the weak points in that plan are most likely to surface first. It would be easy to picture this kind of afternoon as bloodless, all charts and acronyms disconnected from the earlier scenes of a private buffing a barracks floor or a mechanic replacing a filter in a motor pool bay. In practice, though, every slide in that briefing room traces back to exactly those kinds of moments, even when no individual soldier is ever named. A readiness percentage is really just a summary of how many vehicles are running, how many soldiers are medically available for duty, and how many training events actually happened on schedule rather than slipping. The staff officers reviewing that percentage are not inventing new information out of nothing. They are compressing the accumulated labor of hundreds of individual days, much like the ones already followed in this episode, into a form senior leaders can actually use to make decisions under time pressure. The colonel signing off on a readiness assessment is, in a very real sense, still relying on that same private's filter change, several layers removed and never named individually, but still quietly present inside the number on the screen. By evening, the story reaches its widest point, following a general officer through the later hours of this same representative day. This is necessarily the most variable scene in the entire episode, since a general's schedule depends heavily on the specific command, installation, and moment in the training or deployment cycle, and no single itinerary could honestly stand in for all of them. What can be said with reasonable confidence, drawn from doctrine on mission command and senior leadership, is the general shape of the role rather than any fixed daily script. A general typically commands through subordinate commanders rather than through direct personal supervision, relies on a staff to compress enormous amounts of information into usable reports, and often spends a significant share of the day traveling between units, official events, and higher headquarters instead of remaining fixed behind one desk. Picture, then, a restrained command office after dark, map displays glowing along one wall, a general standing at a table with 2 or 3 senior staff officers and perhaps a subordinate commander joining briefly by secure video connection. The conversation moves through a handful of pressing items, a readiness shortfall in one battalion that needs attention before a scheduled evaluation, a travel itinerary for an upcoming visit to another installation, and a personnel matter serious enough to require the general's personal awareness, even though it will likely be resolved by someone several levels below. None of these decisions gets made in isolation. Each one depends on trusting the layers of leaders beneath, down through colonels and majors and captains and platoon sergeants, to have surfaced honest information and to carry out whatever guidance eventually comes back down the chain. This is the moment where the collection's central idea finally becomes fully visible, having built toward it steadily across 7 earlier chapters. Army policy on rank structure describes grades, titles, and lines of authority in careful administrative language, but the lived experience underneath that language is what this day has tried to show all along. A private experiences the Army as one task at one time, guided by an NCO standing close enough to correct him immediately if something starts to go wrong. A general experiences the same Army as a moving structure seen through reports, travel schedules, and trusted subordinate commanders, most of whom the general will never personally observe in person on any given day. Both experiences are entirely real. Neither one is a lesser or more essential version of Army life than the other. They are simply the same organization viewed from opposite ends of a very long chain of responsibility that runs the length of this episode. What connects them, in the end, is not rank alone, but the pattern rank was built to organize. Someone closer to the work watches, corrects, and reports upward, while someone farther from the work receives that information and decides what should happen next, trusting that the details beneath the decision have already been handled honestly. A corporal trusts a private to follow instructions without needing to be told twice. A captain trusts a first sergeant to know the company's true condition better than any slide could show it. A general trusts an entire chain of commanders, most of them strangers by face if not by title, to have done that same unglamorous work of watching and correcting somewhere far below the briefing room table. As the general's evening winds down and the installation outside continues its own version of night operations, gates still staffed, motor pools locked, barracks lights dimming room by room, the day that began before dawn in a single dark barracks room finally closes the loop it opened at the very start. Every rank in between has been living inside that same stretch of hours, doing work suited to its own scale, answerable to the rank above and responsible for the rank below it. The installation does not so much fall silent as rotate its attention, one shift and one duty section handing responsibility to the next in a steady, ordinary transfer that hardly anyone stops to notice, and it is in that low, continuous handoff that tomorrow's formation begins taking shape long before the first boots ever hit the floor.